I am at all times reminded of the grayness in a world I am incapable of changing. Though colors seep into it, flashing brief yet wonderful spring blossoms that die in autumn, what does my existence mean if I can't be beautiful too? I am beset with the most painful feeling, observing a beauty detached from myself. Is it not all life's desire to be beautiful? What then does a life do if he cannot be beautiful? Such things haunt me like the dawn to an insomniac who has spent the entire night restlessly staring at his ceiling, going mad as twisted faces swirl and form in the dark. It was upon realizing this that I declared war on beauty, that all beautiful things would be destroyed, and yet the world was simply a reflection of myself, and all the beautiful things had died a long time ago. The winter of this day took with it all the simple yet profound warmth of a world of gentle indifference. The honeybees no longer buzzed from flower to flower, the foxes no longer chased mice from meadow to field, and the last lions were false kings caged for amusement of a race of man grown ugly and uncaring. The race of man I've been born to. That, Legionaries, is the opening line of Promethean Dreams by Patrick Saltykov, a.k.a. the warrior philosopher, who I'm very pleased to have here on the War Room. And we're just kicking back, relaxing, having some Mai Tais on my U-boat off of the Mediterranean Ocean. But without further ado, welcome. Welcome, warrior. How are you doing today?
Doing excellent. I'm enjoying the drinks concocted by lovely Mediterranean sirens who we've somehow managed not to fall to their songs and have actually figured out a way to train them to be our waitresses on Lance's U-boat. But it's very good to be here as always.
Well, welcome. Yes, it is very much a challenge in and of itself to goad them. It takes a long time. I leave that all up to Sergeant Barnes here. He's the one who deals with the personnel issues. I just enjoy, as an officer, the fruits of the enlisted. But as I was saying, but all jokes aside, though, very happy to have you here. Obviously, we've engaged in the project of DVX Publishing together as co-owners, and also we've long since had communiques. And I remember reading your book for the first time, and after we'd spoken for a while. And I was just frankly blown away because in many ways it kind of reminded me of Yukio Mishima transported into Blade Runner 2049 with a little bit of Fight Club and something like an X Factor in the middle of that, something I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I just knew that I wanted to make sure I published it. But I guess kind of just going into the text itself, because I've been dying to have you on. I'm very pleased to have you on. What was your inspiration as far as writing this book? Because, when I first read it, it was something that you don't really see anymore. You don't really come across, this kind of literature. Much of it has died off in the last few decades here, and especially the aesthetic quality of writing, which focuses on the visuals as opposed to simply, the literary motifs that some college student would talk about in English class. So it's very refreshing in many ways. But I guess I wanted to ask you, what was your inspiration? What kind of spurred you to write this treatise?
It's essentially a speculative piece on how I view one potential path of the future where instead of abundance enabling us to seek the stars, for instance, instead of abundance allowing us to be stronger and actualize will to power, it instead numbs us and narcotizes us and turns us into the last men or the bug men. And I think there is a difference between the last men and the bug men. So I'll go with the last man specifically. Because, of course, in this novel, you're transported into the future where you have essentially the vices of modernity, of the now, but taken to an even greater level. So, of course, today you see the advent of things like virtual pornography, of sex dolls, which eventually will turn into sex robots. You see people living in a false and illusory world where they can get their fixes, but they're not really doing anything. Of course, fixes and ecstasy and joy and lust, all these things came hand in hand with triumph in the past and the pursuit of the Agonal principle. When in modernity, and even more so in this future society, this dystopian society that I attempt to architect, you start to see cheap pleasures given to men of low virtue, of low thumos, and of no noteworthy accomplishments. It comes easy. It comes without sacrifice and without pain. So I thought to myself, what are the things today, the vices today, that are probably going to only accelerate worse into the future? And I thought of essentially this idea of, a virtual world that people live as a substitute, as a cheap substitute to reality. And that's where the idea of the simulations, which I'm sure we'll get into, come into play. But it's essentially just painting the picture of a future society where we have abundance, people seek comfort instead of triumph, and everybody's become narcotized by technology rather than enabled by it. And of course, when I wrote it, it was a long time ago that I wrote it. It was about maybe a year ago, a little less than a year ago. And I, of course, have developed my views a lot since then. But it's still worth noting that I never intended for the book to be a critique of futurism or a critique of technology, but merely, let's say, the liberal or the sort of leftist view of technology. And of course, you and I had our podcast with Rog Nationalist last week, and he brought up that book, Fully Automated Luxury Communism. And in a sense, as he was describing this book, and after I read his essay, Fully Automated Luxury Agonism, which is, of course, what I believe in as well, I thought of the luxury communism, and it's very similar to what I was sort of illustrating in my book. And it's this cheap, disgusting, weak world. But the thing is, with dystopia and with the spiritual apocalypse, it's never going to appear ugly and gray and disgusting. So I want to paint it with neon colors and fluorescent lights, with seductive moans, because that's how it's going to appear. It's going to appear beautifully on the outside to hide the grayness within. So that's another aspect of the book, is I wanted to portray the dystopian future as it actually would be. So that's sort of the impetus of how the story developed. But it was just sort of this aesthetic vision I had in my mind, and as I wrote it, I started to realize the true inspirations of those aesthetic visions I had in my mind, and then it just kind of went from there.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, just to kind of expand on a few of the different threads that we were just kind of touching on here just recently, it reminds me of this idea that people think that a dystopian future would be outwardly appearing to be negative. And, just as the Bible says, for instance, your tender your tender mercies are cruelty too, right? I think most people would perceive a dystopia to be, fangled tooth, evil, disgusting place that was outwardly ugly. And I think a lot of people don't understand that, to fall into the pit of hell, the devil doesn't approach you with, an ugly face and, like a caricature of evil. What he is, he comes and approaches you with the face of the good, right? So, it's seductive. And I think that's what I got from your your story, aesthetically speaking, was that it wasn't necessarily a critique of futurism. It wasn't necessarily a critique of even the neon lights or the aesthetics of a future past beyond nature itself, but rather it was a critique of what the substance of that technology, the application of that techne was. And we'll kind of go into the story here. But what was interesting to me, and since you brought up, fully automated luxury communism slash, Ren's rendition, which is agonism. For you legionaries out there to understand what agonism is, the agon is the competition, right? Is the central mechanism for which Greek culture was made great. It's basically, the idea that all great men were in the gymnasia who competed with each other to prove their excellence, to prove they excel above all others in what is called the spirit of the agon, right? And the curiosity of our time is, or at least it seems to me, is that there are two motives for technology. The one motive, which everyone is accustomed to, is that technology, the purpose of technology is to acquire superabundance of, let's say, goods and services and comfort, and to effectively anesthetize, or, as you say, narcotize pain from our existence. And then, conversely, the other type, which is a more Faustian, more life-affirming, actually is the life-affirming rendition or use of technology, is rather the, let's say, expansion of one's power, of one's possibilities, one's horizons. The advent of the ship, the seafaring ship, and then the clipper ship, and then finally, of course, the screw-propelled mega Panamax freighter. All these things are renditions of the same Faustian longing for greater power of will, greater conquest of nature, higher, heights of human endeavor. And, of course, this finally led into the, spacefaring technology of the 1960s and onwards, and, of course, SpaceX. Now, to return to the story, it's interesting because I remember reading the story of this character, the protagonist, and I don't want to give away too much because, Legionaries, I highly recommend you buy and you read. But the overarching theme, and I think much of this is what kind of grabbed me, especially because it's such a short but potent book, is the arc of, let's say, Notes from the Underground. Are you familiar with Dostoevsky?
Unfortunately, I still have multiple copies that I have not opened yet, so I'm not.
Okay, well, you really have to dig into Notes from the Underground, because it's kind of a story, but obviously transported to his time, and it's a roughly analogous, but only slightly so. I think your work is original enough to merit its own vision, but just to look at from this perspective, right, from the protagonist's perspective, in which the original protagonist of the Notes from the Underground is about this man who lives this just stultifying, decrepit existence. He's just poor, and he's financially poor, and he was slighted, or at least perceived himself to be slighted by this nobleman. And so the entire story is about his, spiraling out of control, spiraling into this feeling of revenge against this imagined slight of this nobleman who had, hurt him some way, right? And for him, it's a story of tragedy, right? It's a story that grounds oneself into the worst elements of humanity, ressentiment in the Nietzschean sense. But what I enjoy about your story is that the hero's story of the protagonist in Promethean Dreams is one which starts from that position, which is to say, to be an enemy of all beauty, right, of all higher beings. And in the Dostoevsky story, it's personified by the nobleman, of course. He wants to kill the nobleman, because what is the noble? What is the good? It's usually, the kalos kagathos, the idea of the man who is the unity of both beauty and excellence of action, right? So that's what nobility truly meant at one time. And so his I guess, galvanizing spirit to try and eliminate this nobleman, this physical manifestation of the excellent, is kind of a surrender to what is base in man, to what is Nietzschean ressentiment. And of course, the contradistinction, of course, is the story of this protagonist who goes through and experiences life and slowly blossoms, like a flower, and comes to ascertain life, ascertain his own beauty, to feel his own beauty. And I wanted to pick your brain as far as what the mechanism for developing your character. What was it that kind of really you provided your character the obstacles in which he could become something greater? What was the mechanism of his becoming, so to say?
Well, first of all, it's a recognition of the invisible bars that exist around us, or around him specifically, which are much worse than the bars that exist today. And they do exist, but not so. They're not so constraining as they might be in the future. So first of all, it's recognizing the ugliness in his world, because most people in his world are too narcotized and too high to recognize the ugliness around them. They're too mesmerized by the neon fluorescent lights to recognize that there's actually a deep set ugliness in their world. And it's sort of like the Matrix. And of course, in the Matrix, you have the character Cypher. And Cypher takes the red pill initially, and he chooses to go with Morpheus and be part of the rebellion against the machines. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, he betrays them later on. And there's a scene where he's talking to the Agent Smiths in the Matrix, and he's eating this ribeye. It's got great marbling, great texture. And he's eating this steak. And he admits, he says, I know the steak isn't real, but it feels real, it tastes real. And so I'd rather have this beautiful illusion, than the ugliness of reality. But of course, to create true beauty, you must first recognize false beauty, and you must reject this false beauty in order to build something of real substance. So of course, you could go on in the Matrix, living on this illusion, but none of it's real. And of course, even though the real world in the Matrix might be very ugly and gray, because it is real, you can actually insert beauty into it. You can't insert beauty into something that isn't real. Mm. And that's sort of a similar analogy to my book, where if anything, the aesthetics are wonderful. And of course, like you mentioned earlier, I'm not criticizing this aesthetic of a neon future, but of course the orientation of which this future is led to. So the mechanism of change in my character is first a recognition of what beauty and ugliness are, recognizing it in himself, and then, of course, after recognition, there's action. There's action based on that recognition, and of course, his own transformation. A lot of it's inspired by Mishima and Mishima's life. Of course, Mishima is this very frail word cell artist type who then later on in life pursues the path of sun and steel. And it's said that one of the moments that thrust him into this will towards actualization of his physical ideals was looking at these Greek statues in Greece, of course. And he looked at how beautiful they were and how they resembled beauty, and how that he wanted to have that beauty too. And of course, in my own book, the sort of similar turning point is a little different, but I think it's still similar. It's when he's in the bar or nightclub, and he's having some drinks, and he sees all these fake people around. And it's worth noting for the legionaries that in this dystopian future society, there's sort of two types of people. There's the people who they eat their slop, they do their virtual reality porn, they have sex with robots, they do drugs. They're sort of the poorer, lower middle class types. But the upper classes still engage in real flesh, and that's sort of something that distinguishes them. They have the money to hire the real prostitutes. They still go out to the nightclubs. they do the drugs together instead of some dark room. And of course, even the main character sort of admires this to some degree because there's still one sense of realness left in the world, even though it's a very misconstrued realness. But he's in a nightclub with these wealthy patrons, the ones who aren't just choosing to live in the simulation. At least they're still going and they're partying in person. But he still sees this false beauty, sees all these women with enhancements, with physical enhancements. They calls them silicon dolls, right? Because of course, something like a breast implant is silicon. I sort of that's sort of my not allegory, but symbolism to describe just plastic surgery, lip fillers, all this stuff in general. And he sees all this fakeness and he just bursts, he just explodes, and he attacks this guy next to him. He smashes a glass onto his face and beats him up. But then, of course, he gets beaten up himself by the bouncers there, who aren't members of the ultra rich. And in that moment, he's actually quite happy. And he's happy because in this world without value, because it's a world of abundance, where nothing really matters because everyone pretty much has as much as they want. You may not be the ultra rich who goes to the nightclub and gets the lip fillers, but you go to a virtual reality center or sim site, as I call them in the book, and you can have all that simulated. It feels just as real, pretty much. So everyone has everything they need. So nothing really matters. There's no value. But then suddenly, because he's beaten in a fight, it shows some order. It shows some value, the value of one's strength over his own. And he's so happy in that moment. And it sort of mirrors, it's a different turning point than Mishima's turning point. But it is still similar. It's this idea of a intention and direction. And of course, as my own ideas evolve, I think it's important to be fluid in where the direction goes, but you still need an ethos. You still need the legion, so to say. You still need your past. You still need your genealogy. And one thing I've been playing around with, a philosophical concept recently, regards to atoms versus quanta. And space is made up of quanta, which don't necessarily possess energy. But then you have atoms, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. Which do have energy. And if you lose your identity and you become too lost, for example, these people in the sim sites, they're lost into these illusions that they buy into, and they can be 1,000 different people, right? In a split second in these simulations, they can be whoever they want. If they want to troon out, they can go be a troon. If they want to live as some Viking warlord back in 800 AD, they can do it. But the more you change and transform and are too fluid rather than enhancing what you are, rather than actually building off of yourself, then you become quanta. You just become space to be inhabited. You don't become the inhabitor anymore. Mm-hmm. The atom inhabits the way that we inhabit. But if we are not anything, if our being is so fluid to the point that our being is just nothing static at all, like no concrete being at all, then you can't be anything. And you aren't anything. You just become quanta. You just become space to be inhabited rather than the inhabiter. And this is something perhaps you could tie to guys like Heidegger as well in his critiques of technology. So it all comes full circle in the story where like I said, this is not a critique of futurism and it's not a critique of technology, but that there needs to be an ethos. There's a good and a bad psychology when using these very dangerous tools. We should not fear them, but we should also understand how to use them properly and with the right motivations and the right animating spirit. So the mechanism of change for this character is sort of tying into all this. And it's essentially being brought back to pain. There's a quote from my book where I say, in a world of like abundant pleasure, pain is the last true feeling, and it's true. If all you feel is pleasure, you cease to feel pleasure. Your dopamine flatlines, right. And you can't really feel good anymore. It's just like you're maintaining that level. So then pain becomes the last true feeling. You feel pain, and pain is what really enhances pleasure as well. And it all comes together, and he understands this through this moment. And it's a very transformative moment and begins this path of Sun and Steel for the character, much like Mishima.
So if you don't mind me interjecting here, because I think it's very interesting and probably the central thesis of the book, to me at least, what I gathered was the most valuable element of it. But the idea that to have true beauty, one has to actually risk something. One actually has to. There has to be something wagered. There has to be something worth losing. There has to be conquest of some kind, and that is the nature of nature itself, right? I mean, the brutality of nature is part and parcel of the beauty of nature, and the balance between the magnitude of its brutality also breeds the heights of its beauty. And I think for me, in the protagonist's perspective, he starts to suss out the fact that a kind of anesthetized, narcotized, hyper reality is completely devoid of these stakes, of the imposition of force, and the rather the kind of let's say agonal spirit, the brutal spirit of nature manifest in its person. Which is interesting because it reminds me of that Marinetti quote, which is, there is no longer beauty except in the struggle. No more masterpieces without an aggressive character. Poetry must be a violent assault against the unknown forces in order to overcome them and prostrate them before men. And ultimately, what I take from this and apply to your story is the interesting part in which, you say that he was kind of not necessarily indifferent as to who won or lost, but rather he found beauty in the exchange, because it's just as you say, there can be no beauty without stakes. There can be no true emotional investment without pain, and the risk of loss and triumph would have no bearing, no substance if there was no loss. And this is, I think, the complete anathema of leftists, because ultimately leftists, they don't like the idea of everyone. Some people have to lose in order for people to win. They want to live in this fake world where basically there can only be everyone wins, but when everyone wins, no one wins, right? Everyone loses, really. And so I think this is the base motivation for a lot of leftists, is they realize that nobody can really win, and so they feel completely spiritually derelict and empty. But to go back to your book, and I hope you bear with me here, Warrior and Legionaries, because it was actually worthwhile reading, the concept of aristocracy, and I guess more deeply, the concept of nature, and thereby the substance of what beauty is. And I'm going to read here, it's roughly 3 paragraphs, so just bear with me here, but it's worth reading. So I'm reading here from Saltykov now. There was an idea of aristocracy, the belief in the higher man who follows closely the heroic ideals of triumph and sacrifice. I imagine what it must have been like, their hair blowing with the wind as they charged their enemies on horseback. These men were carved from marble, men who seized their destiny in the fog of chaos and uncertainty. I take comfort in knowing things were like this once. The knowledge that to lead meant one first had to take, one had to earn his place. Thousands of years ago, if a warrior king had a weak son who did not live up to the reputation and skill of his father, he would inevitably be defeated by someone stronger. Excellence was demanded of the rulers through the nature of constant, violent warfare. Only the strongest and smartest survived. Decadent lines fell to virile ones, and the blood was made pure by the competition of men seeking to become gods. There are no old lions in nature. Once a male lion grows weak, a younger, stronger one challenges him as king of the pride. A young lion inherits nothing. Once he comes of age, he is driven from his clan by his father, and now sees him as a threat. The young prince must brave the unforgiving savannah and forge his own path. Through battles and victories, the young lion grows stronger, smarter. Once he has realized the great and hidden power within him, it is time to claim his kingdom. The budding conqueror finds a pride with many fertile female lions, and a male who has reigned for a decade. A deep understanding exists between the old king and the young prince. The king has fought contenders in the past, his scarred face a testament to his experience. It's why he still sits upon his throne. He knows what must be done and marches forward to meet his fate. The old king was once the young prince, And he knows, for he, the king, there is no retreat. The young prince can fight to live another day, but after years of battling predators and big game, largely dependent on the females to catch prey, the old lion's body is no longer fit for hunting, only combat. The young lion charges forward, baring his teeth, brandishing his claws. The old king strikes quickly and decisively, taking advantage of his knowledge as a veteran of many battles. Though the old king batters the young prince, he is undeterred. As the old lion throws forth attack after attack, he grows more and more tired in his heart. As the young prince's resolve remains unbroken, the old king knows his time has come. He roars a mighty roar and launches forward for one last strike. And it goes on and it finishes here, but I think this is a good place to end in reference to the fight in which our protagonist has, at that nightclub. And even though, of course, the allegory is not a one-to-one parody, of course he loses the conflict, you can start to understand what is exactly the mechanism of beauty. Because even in that beautiful exposition, by the way, Saltykov, Warrior, I really loved this writing. It really conjures the images of like a kind of savannah in your mind, in your mind's eye, and you can see the blood spurt from the beautiful loins and bodies of these like titanic animal forces, squaring off with one another, and kind of the modality and evolution of nature as it goes from generation to generation. But it is interesting to me, in this kind of unrepentant, undiminished, virile exposition of life, there's this vitalism to affirming not simply the dominance of the young prince, but also the triumph of the old king to have met his end, his fate, regardless of the outcome that he knew was foregone at some point, right? I mean, we all meet our death at some point, but there is this poetry that exists because of the very fact that ultimately, there are stakes, there is this brutality, there's this pain, and it is in the pain and extirpation and subjugation and conflict of life that there is actual substance to the vision of beauty, the vision of strength. And there's this absence in the narcotized hyper reality of let's say like the internet, for instance, in which if you die or you lose, the stakes are very low. You just start again, right? It's not the same when you're playing the game of life. Beauty only arises from life because of the fact that you're playing with all your poker chips, and it's do or die. But and I feel this experience with the protagonist, and I feel very closely, especially as a young man when I was very, very young. I felt as though, especially in school, in places that were very heavily culturally important for young guys. So, for instance, not simply video games, but also the sports field, right? This sentiment that it didn't matter, like the victory or loss, or like nobody really put their all into something. And the only time I felt the beauty of life be real were the stakes and the pain and the suffering and the triumph and tragedy of victor and vanquished happen when I was actually doing jiu-jitsu as a young kid. I was 5 years old, and the exhilaration of triumph, but also the depth of defeat and what it meant for my soul. But I was able to reflect from a third-person perspective the beauty of being able to fight, of being able to win, or just contend. And I think that's what's most evocative about your story. I wanted to ask you, how do you feel exactly when you're writing that passage? Is this the central element that's missing from the hyper-reality? Is this, because for me, I don't dislike futurism. I love futurism. I like the idea of technology, but with ever-increasing capabilities, we must remember not to atrophy ourselves spiritually, and to apply this techne to the, let's say, fulfillment of the will as opposed to its stifling. I wanted your perspective on technology and the role of stakes, of kind of pain when it comes to actual beauty? What is it that confers? I mean, I guess you talk about space and physical imposition, but you know, for me, it seems like the existential experience of, let's say, winner takes all stakes really kind of sticks out to me as the emotive, volitive value of the protagonist of Promethean Dreams. What do you think?
Well, I've did a speech recently on this, on the necessity of violence as a creative force, and that all creation is preceded by destruction and thus violence, and that ultimately the act of killing is involved in all forms of creation. And when we discuss the development of Techne and how its relationship evolves with humanity, I think the further you are separated from, let's say, the agonial principle of what life really is, and that all things that we have and all things that we will have, and then all things that we maintain are maintained and won and bought only through blood, the blood of ourselves and of our enemies. Something as simple as what we're using now to enjoy this wonderful conversation. There's plenty of college Marxists today, for instance, who will tweet out, "Fight the system, smash fascism," from a MacBook or an iPhone. And that iPhone is bought through slavery, through blood, through probably human trafficking and sex slavery and all sorts of incredibly violent things. These lithium batteries, obviously, going into these technologies are coming from being mined in the Congo. These are literal slaves that are being used to extract this.
Yep.
And I'm not saying this to make people feel bad. It's just the reality of life. And even once we have this automation of the future, without that distinction, without the distinction of human types, and without that violent creation, life really ceases to exist. As you can see clearly in this story, is that without something to both destroy and then create, and without something to distinguish yourself from, life really becomes purposeless and meaningless. You know what? True nihilism is just unending pain, unending pleasure. Even Camus says we must think of Sisyphus as happy. It's easier to have meaning in endless pain than endless pleasure, I think.
Yes.
Which is maybe a bit of a controversial take to some, but in this future, right, where I'm demonstrating one specific potential path of futurism and of techne, and of course it's more akin to this sort of reductionist, ultra-materialistic view of techne rather than techne as a creative force. But you see it in innovation today, and this is something I've talked about pretty much for the entirety of having a YouTube channel, is that today most innovation is done to make life easier, to make life more comfortable, to make life more pleasurable. And you mentioned the space race back in 1960, and of course there are political implications to this in regards to the propaganda victory that we had over the Soviet Union because of winning the space race. But besides that, there's also the Faustian will. There's the will to go beyond yourself and to beautify the cosmos and to unveil the cosmos and to insert yourself into the cosmos and onto the cosmos. You know, you have to impregnate the cosmos. There's this will that is very distinct from the guy who in this dystopian future creates the sim site, for instance. Why did he create the sim site? Now, at the same time, you could say, well, you could create the sim site to do good things. Perhaps it could be a training ground, right, for these sort of futuristic space marines or something. They use these sim sites to simulate combat, and then that would be a good use of the techne. So the orientation, the psychological orientation of the use of techne is incredibly important. Well, why did they create this? Facebook, you can't name a single reason other than comfort and pleasure and consumption that something like Facebook or Meta was created. Or like a sex robot, for instance. Well, why do we need sex robots? And I don't like to distill everything to utility, to its use, but at the same time, it's worth noting, well, what is the use of something? Because even when it comes to creation and it comes to art, there is still an initial objective foundation that it's built off of. So I've talked about in many of my videos of beauty being an aesthetic of violence, for instance, right? So the Greek body was considered beautiful because it enabled them to expand their will to power, to expand the hegemony of the Greeks. So there was a real objective purpose, but it doesn't only have to be that. I'm not an antiquarian. I'm not saying we have to go back to anything. But you also have to be aware of your mythos. You have to be aware of what Dr. Jason Georgiani says is novel folklore. You need to embrace an ethos of a past, whether true or not, to be able to build a future. And this is something Nietzsche alludes to as well. He talks about the sort of positivistic, reductionist, materialist, whatever. They have no reason to build a future if they don't have a past to build off of, right? So if you don't have a past to build off of, you also don't have a future. And I think that's true of these things that maybe some people will say is antiquated. Some people might say violence is antiquated in modernity, but at the same time, there is a psychological imposition that comes from it, which is necessary for even the form or the creation of forms that we use in the future.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting that you say that because ultimately, I mean, it reminds me of this Nietzsche quote here where it basically talks about the essence of life. And, I mean, to be frank with you, we're organic beings, and so there must be some kind of inherent relationship with life and our idea of the beautiful, right? And, you know, just reading here from Nietzsche, of course, is life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, overpowering of what is alien and weaker, suppression, hardness, imposition of one's own forms, incorporation, and at least at its mildest, exploitation. If it is a living and not a dying body, it will have to be an incarnate will to power. It will strive to grow, spread, seize, become predominant. Not from any morality or immorality, but because it is living, and because life simply is will to power. But there is no point on which the ordinary consciousness of Europeans resists instruction as on this. Everywhere people are now raving, even under scientific guises, about coming conditions of society in which the exploitative aspect will be removed. Which sounds to me as if they promise to invent a way of life that will dispense with all organic functions. Exploitation does not belong to a corrupt or imperfect and primitive society. It belongs to the essence of what lives as a basic organic function. It is a consequence of the will to power, which is, after all, the will of life. And so, end quote, by the way. But, you know, it's interesting to me because we keep on circling around this kind of central element of what the story of, you know, the Promethean Dreams is. And to me, I think when we engage with the technological and we ascribe to it a number of different, you know, Ted K vibes as to the reason for our downfall, our decadence, I think technology, people conflate technology with the way technology is being used. Because remember, many societies have been decadent before us, and on an objective level, the subjective experience of decadence is the same. Plenitude breeds weakness. Weakness breeds a lack of will to life, which in itself, you know, kind of seeks to cleave itself from the exploitative, conflict-prone, or the essence of life itself being conflict. And, you know, to me, technology is not the problem. And just to kind of go back here, I see what others see in technology, the same problems we had in the past, which is, let's say, 1950s suburbia. And if you've listened to me previously, you'd hear the same things where I think the majority of our ills today were born in the 1950s, in the suburban ideal in which man and woman were insulated through comfort, through basically the complete, let's say, Shire-like divorce from nature, divorce from suffering, divorce from having to deal with actual true stakes of life, which is, you know, an artificially safe environment, an artificial environment in and of itself, a kind of pattern of living which was devoted to comfort, which sought it as it God. And I think what the greatest and most vital thing about your story, Warrior, is the fact that there was this something so deep in man, something so completely unconquerable, insatiable, that in spite of being born and from the moment of birth being brainwashed to think that this is the height of man, that ultimately there comes this deeper voice within everyone's soul, the fire of one's soul, the thumos of one's soul, to yell out "and yet," and to go out and to execute on the instincts which are inborn in the highest of us. And so for me, I don't want to give away the story, Legionaries, because I know many of you would like to know the story. I don't mind knowing about the arc of a story prior, but I know many of you do care about that, so I'll make sure to keep it a little bit vague as far as how the story ends. But it's not necessarily about the end, and I hope you understand that that's just like about life. It's about the aesthetic quality of life, the existential manner in which we engage with the world, that also, in and of itself, if you're living a life, worthy of its calling of life, it will cause pain, it will cause suffering, it will be the emanation of conflict itself. And so, for me, I mean, what's interesting to me, and since you brought up Mishima and much of the aesthetic quality, by the way, excellent writing. I haven't seen writing like that in a very long time, and it's part of the reason why I felt like I had to publish your script here, was the aesthetic quality associated from nature to something that we might think as completely, I guess, divorced from nature, right? So, I remember reading like parts of illusions of nature of cherry blossoms and meeting the death of autumn, or, for instance, the talking, the spoken aristocratic nature of lions and so on, with, of course, the juxtaposition of this man living a very kind of infernal life in a dystopian neon future, which is completely artificial and devoid of all those kind of natural, let's say, outward projections of what nature would look like, but sharing the same essence, same continuity of the same mechanism of nature in his actions. And so I wanted to talk before we get a little bit deep here, because I know we're headed on the 1 hour mark, and I know we have to step out here on a mission here soon. But I wanted to just gather your thoughts as far as literature is concerned, going into the future, about what makes for, the literature or the spirit of the future in a time when the technology and the increasing decadence of our time seems to be this all-pervasive, undiminished tide rising. But how is it that we are able to reach out to those souls, just like the character from Promethean Dreams? How do we reach out to boys and girls like that to kind of scream out in front of the endless multitudes of bots, to scream out, I'm a man or a woman, and I feel flesh for real, and I exist in life as a real life? How do we write that way? And what were you inspired by?
Of course, I'm inspired by Mishima, books like Fight Club, movies like Fight Club. Also, in general, just an experience of life. I'd say that the way you reach people is that ultimately there are going to be many belief systems that change over time because of the context of that era of history that are going to change. But then there's certain things that are both primordial and eternal that do not change. There are certain instincts that subsist into the future from the past. And that ultimately, when you create art, it has to be animated by the spirit of a higher psychology and a higher psychological imposition. And when you delve into which psychologies ultimately triumph over others and create things that are more beautiful, create things that invigorate the soul, you can start to see different forms which can assist with this psychology. So we look at ideologies or philosophies, for instance, and of course many of them have changed throughout history. There are these forms that support a base psychological nature which is higher. And one of my projects is being able to describe this psychological orientation, both, like I say, primordially and then eternally, both where we've seen it in the past and how we will see it manifest in the future. And generally, that's a psychology of beautiful creation. And then you say, well, how do you define beauty? And then what exactly is beautiful creation? That's perhaps a conversation for another time, which, I go into that topic a lot in my own podcasts. But essentially, the mission of the future when it comes to things like art and books and writing, it's to inspire this higher psychology that will lead to creation, because the future doesn't belong to the bureaucrats or the technocrats. Technical skills are going to become ever increasingly nullified by the automation of artificial intelligence. The future is going to belong to those with vision. It's going to belong to those who can use these technical skills to create and to enhance themselves to create more. So I think going forward, what I want to do with my work is to inspire a generation of people who want to create, but they want to create beautifully, inspired by a higher psychology. There are good and bad uses of technology, the same way that there's good and bad evolutions of human types. Because take something like transhumanism, for instance. We discussed the different sort of animating factors of transhumanism. We've talked about the difference between the athlete who uses performance-enhancing drugs or the special forces operator compared to the transgender, for instance. This is both a use and appropriation of future technology, but for very different purposes. One is animated by beauty, in a sense. They're animated to create, because you can't have creation without hard power. The military is the reason why art exists. You would not have art without the military. So the special forces operator is an artist of his own, and he's contributing to art in his own way, perhaps even if he himself is not writing books or painting canvases. He's contributing by providing the basis which allows the artist to create. And I would argue that the greatest artists are intimate with both sides, men like Junger, men like Mishima. Even Nietzsche, of course, served as well. But or the bodybuilder or the athlete, they're trying to do something more than themselves. They're trying to insert themselves onto nature, onto the cosmos, in a capacity that they can't do without enhancing themselves through techne, or in this case, PEDs. While the transgender uses hormone replacement therapy to be more comfortable, to escape, to cope with their hatred of life. It's not to enhance themselves, it's to transform themselves entirely. So the transgender is like what I was describing earlier with the quanta. They're turning themselves into empty space. They're not enhancing or building off of a genealogy of their life or their past. They're just trying to escape entirely. It's no different than the death cults that we see with asceticism and theism. It's the same thing. And you can look at this specific example and find the psychological motivations for either. And then once you've identified that psychological motivation, you think, well, how do I create a form to promulgate it and to propagandize it and to make it palatable? Not palatable, fuck palatable. I don't give a fuck about palatable. Make it attractive to the youths. The youths are everything. The boomer is done. The age of the boomer is over. The age of millennial is over. Who cares?
Right.
It's over.
That's right.
It's so over for them. The future belongs to us, those animated by a youthful spirit, the same youthful spirit that the Greeks so passionately affirmed. And my art and my works are going to be all dedicated to that mission, to expanding that worldview, expanding that psychology, and cultivating our abilities to create forms which that psychology can inhabit and which will allow it to grow and will allow it to bloom and ultimately triumph over the forces of darkness, over the forces of ugliness. We will defeat the gray waste with colorful lights, true colorful lights, not just colorful in a physical aesthetic, but the psychological as well, animated by that spirit of creation for something more. These neon lights that will exist in our future will not just be neon lights for the sake of being neon lights. They're going to also be underpinned by a martial culture, by virtue, by agonism, by this spirit of Andrea, of manliness, and of arete, excellence. Ultimately, all these things, technology, artificial intelligence, the singularity, they're inevitable. What's not inevitable is what we're going to do with them. Mm-hmm. So my entire project is dedicated towards what I believe, what I know in my heart is the correct path to take all these inevitable things. It's right now I'm a substitute for Paul Atreides, and I see many paths in front of me, and all of them lead to jihad. All of them lead to holy war. Will we win the holy war, or will we be defeated? Either we will walk over our enemies' bodies, or they will walk over ours.
It is the manner in which we meet that end, which connotes victory, right, or defeat. And Warrior, you and I will meet that end no matter what it is, with a victory within, right? Well, without further ado, Legionaries, I just wanted to introduce you, our, Patrick Saltykov, or AKA the Warrior Philosopher, my partner, my friend, my brother. And just go ahead and you are commanded to buy the book. You are commanded to read it. It's absolutely an essential read. In future transmissions, we will be communicating about it more, dissecting some of the motifs as we go along. But I just wanted to say thank you so much, Warrior, not simply for coming on and talking about your book, but for actually having put it out there. I know it takes a lot of courage, a lot of confidence to be able to not simply put out something worth reading, but actually doing it and putting your name to it. That means a lot. So as a kind of cheers to your, not simply your triumph, but as your courage, thank you so much, and I really do appreciate that.
Well, thank you for your support on this journey. Obviously, with DVX, that was something that we wanted to put out, and of course couldn't have done it without Lance. So of course I'm very thankful as well. And the gods, we will transcend even the gods one day. We will transcend even what transcends the gods, and we'll keep going into the future and actualize eternity.
That's right. Well, thank you so much, brother, and I think it's time to make port and to do interesting things with these sea sirens that we've managed to skirt up on board. But without further ado, thank you so much again, and thank you, Legionaries, for listening. Like I said, I'll have the book in the transmission notes below. Your mission is to read it. It's very short, very impactful, and one of the foremost treatises or expositions of art I have seen in a very long time, worth reading, worth seeing, worth experiencing. I've read it, 3 or 4 times over now. It's exceptional every time, and there's always this kernel of gold in every fold of turn of phrase and page. So without further ado, thank you so much. This is General Lance, Sergeant Barnes, Patrick Saltykov, and this is the War Room, signing off.